With the threat of a Russian invasion looming large over Ukraine, Western leaders have warned Putin that any incursion will be met with heavy sanctions. At the moment, this doesn't seem to be working. At the time of writing, Putin still has over 100,000 troops stationed on the Ukrainian border, despite reports of a partial withdrawal. So, given all this, we thought it would be a good time to do a video on sanctions, and more specifically, whether they actually work. We're going to split this video into 3 parts. Firstly, we're going to explain what sanctions actually are and how they've evolved over time. Secondly, we're going to take a look at whether they're an effective foreign policy instrument. And thirdly, we're going to take a look at what determines their efficacy. Concluding that, unfortunately, sanctions are becoming less effective thanks to the new multipolar world order. By the way, before we start, if you want more videos on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, then you can find them over on the TLDR EU channel. The link to that and a full playlist is in the description. So before we get on to whether sanctions work, let's explain what they are. The word sanction essentially refers to any coercive economic measure. These might include prohibitively high tariffs, quotas, asset freezes, asset seizures, or even full-on trade embargoes. The first recorded use of sanctions was in 432 BC, when the Athenian Empire banned traders from Megara from their marketplaces, in order to hurt the rival city-state's economy. Sanctions became increasingly popular in the early 20th century, when they became the foreign policy instrument of choice for the League of Nations and then later the UN. This was largely because globalization really began around this time, which meant that most countries' economies were now dependent on international imports and exports, and therefore more vulnerable to sanctions. Up until the 90s, sanctions were usually directed at entire economies. These were known as comprehensive sanctions. But this all changed after the UN imposed sanctions on Iraq following its invasion of Kuwait in 1990. The country-wide sanctions they imposed exacted a heavy toll on the Iraqi economy, as well as its citizens. UNICEF estimated that some 500,000 Iraqi children died as a result, and the UN finally realised that comprehensive sanctions could have massive collateral damage. So beginning in the 90s, the UN and its member states began to use so-called targeted sanctions. Targeted sanctions are basically any sanctions that don't affect a whole country, but rather sectors of their economy, specific companies, individuals, or groups of officials. So, to take Iraq as an example, instead of sanctioning the whole country and killing thousands of children, you'd just sanction Saddam and his cronies, and hope that they changed course. Targeted sanctions also make more sense than comprehensive sanctions because they don't affect the sanctioning country as much. For example, if the US sanctioned the whole of China over Xinjiang, this would really hurt the US economy. So instead, they've sanctioned exports from Xinjiang and certain companies that are running the Xinjiang labour camps. It's a similar story with Russia at the moment. The West isn't threatening to sanction all of Russia. It's mostly threatening to sanction Putin's cronies and maybe Putin himself. Now, it's worth saying that targeted sanctions still aren't collateral free. Targeted sanctions against Iran's Revolutionary Guard and the Iranian banks that help finance the regime's nuclear program have hurt the living standards of normal Iranians, with Iran's GDP per capita falling by about 70% since 2012. Nonetheless, in general, targeted sanctions have less collateral than comprehensive sanctions, which is why they've become the foreign policy tool of choice. So that's what sanctions are. But now for the big question. Do they work? Well, at first glance, the answer seems to be no. There are 2 well-renowned sanctions databases that suggest that sanctions have a success rate of well below 50%. The Peterson Institute of International Economic Sanctions database suggests a success rate of about 33%, while the UN Targeted Sanction Consortium suggests a rate of about 25%. Interestingly, targeted sanctions and comprehensive sanctions are about equally effective, at least according to these databases. But while a success rate of below 50% might look bad, there are a couple of caveats worth mentioning. Firstly, while sanctions don't usually achieve their primary objective, they can still help. Take Trump's sanctions on North Korea, for example. Trump, by the way, loved sanctions, basically more than any other president in history. But regardless, in September 2017, Trump essentially imposed a comprehensive sanction on North Korea via Executive Order 13810, which cut any company trading with North Korea out of the US financial system. Now, while these sanctions failed their primary objective, stopping North Korea from developing nuclear missiles, they did help Trump bring North Korea to the negotiating table, and they eventually agreed to a hiatus on missile tests. This is a good example of where sanctions technically failed, but nonetheless helped to achieve a better outcome. The second caveat worth mentioning is that while sanctions might not have been particularly effective, they have to be measured up against other coercive foreign policy instruments. Broadly, these are diplomacy, appeals to international legal tribunes, threats of war, and actual war. Sanctions are appealing because they're lower risk than war or the threat of war, while still being more effective than diplomacy or international law. The basic point here is that coercing another sovereign state is hard. So the fact that sanctions are only occasionally effective is in some sense unsurprising, and sanctions are arguably better than the other alternatives. But you get the point. While sanctions usually fail to achieve their primary objectives, this doesn't mean that they're entirely ineffective, and they're arguably better than the other available coercive foreign policy instruments. But on to the last part of the video. What makes sanctions effective? Well, there are quite a few good correlates for sanction efficacy. To name a few, sanctions are more effective if A. There's high pre-sanction trade between the sanctioning and the sanctioned countries. B. The sanctions are unanticipated. And C. They've got a well-defined goal. But to our minds, the two most important factors when it comes to determining sanctioning efficacy are whether the country being sanctioned is democratic and whether the sanctions are implemented multilaterally. Let's start with democracy. Autocratic regimes are generally less responsive to sanctions for two reasons. Firstly, autocratic leaders are less responsive to public pressure than their democratic counterparts. This means that if sanctions hurt the living standards of their citizens, as they usually do, autocrats are less likely to change course. Good examples of this are Iran, where a substantial drop in Iranian living standards has failed to shift the Iranian government's focus away from nuclear weapons development, and Russia, where sanctions introduced after the illegal annexation of Crimea brought GDP per capita down about 35% since 2013. Despite falling living standards for ordinary Russian citizens, sanctions clearly haven't deterred Putin, who's refused to withdraw Russian forces from Crimea, and now looks likely to pull a similar trick in Donbass. The second reason that sanctions are less likely to work with autocrats is that autocratic countries tend to have a more tightly controlled media, who are likely to put blame on the sanctioning countries rather than the reigning autocrat, further insulating the autocrat from public pressure. So, combined, sanctions work best in democracies, where leaders are responsive to any sanctions-induced fall in living standards and the public pressure that comes with it. The second important factor, if you want an effective sanction, is multilateralism. Essentially, sanctions are most effective when agreed and implemented by many countries. If sanctions are only implemented by a few countries, then the sanctioned country can just start trading with a different country that hasn't decided to sanction them. This has increasingly become a problem due to the frail relationship between America, China, and Russia. Now, when America sanctions a country, China and Russia usually replace them as trading partners. For example, China has recently signed a $400 billion energy and infrastructure deal with Iran, and Russia has provided economic support to Venezuela, which has been under US sanctions since 2006. With the Russians offering this in return for lucrative stakes in Venezuelan oil projects. Both China and Russia are also developing their own alternatives to the SWIFT financial system, which is dominated by the US. China launched the cross-border interbank payment system in 2015, and Russia has been developing its own financial messaging system for the transfer of financial messages. This doesn't mean that the expulsion of SWIFT wouldn't do damage to the Russian economy. It's just unlikely to be effective in the future once these alternative systems are up and running. And this trend probably applies to sanctions more generally, with Russia and China more willing than ever to undermine US sanctions, and vice versa. Sanctions are going to become a whole lot less effective. And this is pretty bad news for everyone, because while it's true that some US sanctions are clearly unfair and excessive, but the growing impotence of sanctions will mean that countries will have to resort to other coercive foreign policy measures, like, well, war. Anyway, what do you think? Should we hope for international cooperation to rejuvenate sanctions as a foreign policy instrument? Or should we just accept that multilateral sanctions are a thing of the unipolar past? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, as I said at the start, we made a whole bunch of videos on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, all of which can be found over on the TLDR EU channel or on the playlist link below. So be sure to subscribe over there, as well as to this channel, and hit the bell to be notified every time we release a new video. A special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.